Okay guys, so in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to connect the 3 rows of your block in order to complete your quilt block. So at this point, you have row 1, row 2, and row 3. Well, maybe you don't have row 2 yet, but that is what you're getting ready to cut. That's going to be our first step of completing our quilt blocks. So what I want you to do is just follow the instructions that I provided for you in your instructional and go ahead and cut out your 2-inch by 17-inch rectangles. And again, this is for your center row, row 2. And there's a couple different ways to set up for accuracy, because what we want to ensure is that, I'm going to bring these back over, but what we want to ensure as we're putting our blocks together is that our seams are aligned. And what I mean by our seams is this seam is aligned with this seam. We don't want to end up sewing our rows together and this one being offset. So in order to ensure that these are all in a straight line, there's a couple different techniques. In the pattern that I'm using for this class, she does not go into detail about this or how to set up for this. So that's why I provided that for you in the kind of, like my lesson notes, lesson plan notes that I share with you guys each week. So you can look through your instructional for the first technique that I'm going to show you. And then there's also another trick. So I'll share that with you a little bit later. So after you have your 2-inch by 17-inch rectangles cut, we're ready to start attaching. And one of the most critical things that you want to get into the habit of is when you are ready to start connecting your rows, go ahead and position your rows in the order that you want them to appear. This is especially important as we continue to build a quilt or continue to build the quilt top. But we want to go ahead and set these up in the order that we want them. For instance, it could be very easy to make the mistake of sewing this like this, right? Sewing it on upside down. So we want to make sure that before we start doing any sewing, that we have our pieces positioned in the right way. So to prepare row 2 for our quilt block, what we're going to do is we're just going to take a ruler and we're going to make placement marks. So if you've ever done any garment sewing, you probably have heard of notches, and notches are just placement points on your pieces that help show you where to position them when you're ready to go sew. So in a way, this is kind of acting like a notch. However, we're not going to snip this. We're not going to make any cuts. We're just making a mark. So what I want to do is go ahead and measure from the end of my rectangle. I'm going to measure up 8 inches. And using an erasable marking tool, whatever your favorite is, you're just going to make a little line here and a little line here, okay, just on top and bottom. I would suggest not drawing all the way across, especially with the friction pins, because they can leave a ghost line, which just means it's going to reappear as a translucent line later. So, I would just make your marks just on the edge at the top and at the edge of the bottom. Okay, and if you want to do that with all your rectangles, you can, or you can just do them as you start making your quilt blocks. But what we want to do next is we're ready to attach row 2 to row 1. So we're going to flip this piece over so that it's right side down on row 1. And we're especially mindful of this placement point. We want to make sure that we stack it directly on top of the seam. So we've got that. I introduced these pins in class last week. If you missed class, then you may have received the email I sent with a link, but these are fork pins. They're made by Clover and they're forked. So they work really, here we go. They work really well for pinning. I'll try to zoom in there. For pinning your seams so that you don't get twisted seams you know, on the under layer of your quilt block. So instead of pinning left and right with individual pins, these work in the way that you can pin and it's holding those edges in place. Okay, so at this point, we are just going to go ahead and start pinning the rest of this one. I like to pin at every seam, and that way I know that those edges are held back in place, just like that. Okay, so we're back. I have my piece pinned and I'm ready to sew. And this is just like we normally would, nothing special about this. We're just going to sew all the way down. And as you're sewing, just make sure you keep those edges, any edges that are, you know, loose between your pins, make sure you keep those together. Take this one out. You're just going to continue sewing all the way down this side. Okay, so I finished sewing on row 2, and I just want to zoom in here to show you where that placement point ended up after I sewed it. So when I peel this back, you can see how that placement point intersects the seam. So those are stacked directly on top of each other. So what we're going to do now is we don't want to iron this yet because we have our placement mark and we don't want to erase that. So we're simply going to put this back in position just like I had stated before. We want to keep our position, you know, our rows in the position that we want them to appear on our quilt when they're finished. I'm just trying to adjust this for you. Okay, so what we're going to do, we have our other placement point here, right? So what we're going to do is that placement point is going to line up with this seam. So we want to flip this piece right side down onto row 3. We're just bringing that over. And then just peel back that layer to see where your placement point is and go ahead and pin that seam. Make sure you pin this seam first. And then once you get that secure, you can continue pinning to the left of that pin, and you want to pin from here going out to the left, and then pin from here going out to the right. Okay, so here we are at the machine, and again, we're just sewing a basic seam, just like we've been doing. And you'll continue sewing at your 1/4 inch all the way down this side. And hopefully, if all goes well, our placement points and our seams will all stack and be aligned nicely. Nothing will be, you know, out of square. Okay, so now we're at the ironing mat, and at this point, you kind of know the routine here, but you're just going to work your way across, pressing your seams open. Okay, and at this point, our block is completed. The last step that we need to take is just squaring up these ends of the rectangles on row 2. So you're just going to take your straight edge and trim here so that it's even with your row 1 and 3, and the same thing on the left. So just trimming those evenly, and you will repeat this with all of your quilt blocks. Okay, so I want to show you one more technique that might work well for you, and you can decide which technique you prefer. The first technique, remember I showed you how to mark in 8 inches from one end of your 2 inch by 17 inch rectangles and make your placement lines. This one is a little bit different, and what you're going to do is go ahead and sew row 1 and 2 together. At this point, you haven't made any placement lines on row 2 at all. You're just attaching it to row 1. Once you have it attached to row 1, we're going to take our ruler, and we are going to line up the edge of our ruler with this seam. So this unit, this side of the unit, we want it in line, just like that. And we also want it square across the bottom of row 2. So we're lining up here and we're lining up here. And once you get that in place, you're going to take your marker and make your placement line here. So we're still making a placement line, but we're making it after we have attached row 2 to row 1. And from there, you're just going to follow the same steps that we did previously. We're going to have row 3 attached, and when we are pinning it, we're going to align this seam with our placement point. So just kind of bringing that down so those two are stacked together. And you'll begin pinning from here. Sorry about that. From here, and then pin your way going left and right. Always pinning from here going out. That way any excess fabric gets fed to the outside edges. So try that and see if that works for you, and then you can decide which technique works best.